And this related to a constant battle that we could see coming through in our data, where on the one hand, people were keen to pay and have contributions to the research, communication and engagement process recognised. At the same time, they talked about the practicalities of that being challenging and how hard it was to move away from things like Amazon vouchers in paying people. But they also talked about working with some participants who were keen not to be paid because they saw their involvement in engagement and communication as being about giving something back. Finally, in terms of relationships, our interviewees and focus group participants talked about a desire to ensure that there was a legacy happening in relationships, that relationships were longer term. They talked about the limitations of short-term funding in science communication, meaning that sometimes you would cultivate a really good relationship with a community group, for instance, but then suddenly the funding wasn't there. How do you maintain that relationship? How do you ensure, in the same way that we might be worried about parachute research, that engagement and communication activities don't simply work with a group, an individual or a community for a short time period and then disappear? So these were all ethical issues that arose in relation to relationships. We also saw a number of comments coming up around content. In this particular quote, which comes from one of our anonymised community organisation representatives, they talked about a real dilemma that they had faced when working with a community where air pollution was a significant factor. But for that particular community, the ability to change that or influence it was somewhat out of their control. It wasn't their doing that they had found themselves in this situation. So it had been a real dilemma as to how to think about talking to them about their community being more highly affected, but making sure that there was support in place, that they could move on after that engagement and communication and utilise resources that would be useful for them. And content came up in a variety of different ways in regards to ethical dimensions. Often the people that we were talking to talked about ethical issues actually being a motivating factor in their communication and engagement. Perhaps not unexpectedly, a lot of communication and engagement work is focused on ethical dimensions of scientific issues, and this was at the heart of their motivations for being involved in it. But they also talked about sometimes there being important reasons to exclude topics from communication. Maybe it would be of detriment to people actually to have particular health information, for instance. Perhaps it wasn't necessarily something that they felt comfortable in sharing, even if there was scientific or health-based evidence around it, and they would need to think about that in developing that work. And they also talked about exclusion in terms of deciding on particular groups or funders that they perhaps wouldn't work with, that there would be a moral reason why they felt the values of that organisation did not fit with their own motivations as a team. So exclusion also cropped up in regards to content that might be, or relationships that might not be utilised. Framing was important here. This has been discussed quite a lot in science communication already, but our interviewees and focus group participants talked about thinking over different ways that they framed information and the different ethical considerations that that might involve. They talked about sometimes feeling that they were campaigning for science and that that could be ethically problematic. And also the importance of making sure that in any framing it was very transparent where information was true. One science centre practitioner, for instance, talked about using actors in a particular public engagement setting, and that it had been clear afterwards that it wasn't obvious to audience members that those people were actors and that that had brought them something of an ethical dilemma. So this idea of framing came through as well. And finally, under this theme, processes and practicalities could be ethically problematic. I've already alluded to the difficulties and challenges of paying people within the engagement and communication process, but they also talked about things like timings, transportation to events and activities, location, as being potential ethical barriers that could disenfranchise people from the communication process. In terms of implications, here, Lucy talks about the concerns that some of our researchers expressed, that information that they share or communicate around could be used by others. So there was a concern amongst some of our participants that potentially, even if you're very ethically diligent, in the information that you communicate and engage around, that can be used by others in different ways. And here, the sorts of things that we saw coming up, whilst sometimes leading to very positive implications from the science communication engagement processes we would expect and probably hope for as science communicators, this did provide a space for quite a lot of conversation around some of the more negative implications that there could be. And this could be negative implications for participants if, for instance, the science communication activity was not of high quality or good value to them in terms of use of their time, for example. It also impacted on researchers. So there were concerns around how engagement and communication activities were resourced and supported, but also around accountability. So if there was an ethical problem with a particular project, where did the responsibility for that lie? And finally, practitioners talked about a variety of ethical implications for them. We had, for instance, curators discussing designing exhibitions where they themselves thought very carefully about some of the challenges that there might be for the staff on the floor of their museum when that exhibition was live and interacting with different participants. So the potential implications of communication and engagement activities also had a lot of ethical dimensions to them. And then finally, in terms of codes under this theme, we have a quote here from Isla that reflects that for many of our interviewees and focus group participants, the ethical dimensions that they were considering were part of a broader conversation happening, particularly in the two cities in which this research was based, around topics like decolonisation, equitable practice, equality, diversity and inclusion, and also a broader conversation around the climate crisis as well. And so we see that different political landscapes were influencing the way in which the people that we were in contact with as part of this data collection were thinking about the work that they were doing in a communication and engagement space, and also leading to challenges in terms of thinking through how they appropriately communicated and engaged with a variety of different audiences. So to start to wrap up, I've got here some preliminary conclusions. We're still analysing quite a lot of the data from this project at the moment because it wasn't too long ago that we finished our data collection. But some of the things that we've already noted already are that whilst we can see some very clear linkages between the data that we've collected and existing work in the theoretical space around science communication ethics, we're also seeing that some of that theoretical work understandably doesn't quite go far enough in terms of some of the situations people are experiencing in their practices. We're also seeing that there are sometimes tensions between there being different goals to science communication and engagement. As I said earlier, we didn't necessarily see that as problematic in our data collection, but when we started this project, we'd perhaps perceived that we could come up with some kind of framework or guidance that would be usable across a range of different settings. And understandably, what we found is that there's much more diversity than that. There won't be a one-size-fits-all approach to thinking about ethics in a communication context. What we have found, though, is lots of people enjoying and appreciating moments of reflection. And this links to some existing work around everyday ethics that we've been utilising to think about this in our data analysis. We were really struck that many of our participants talked about and thanked us at the end of our interviews and focus groups for the opportunity to reflect on what they were doing and to share it with others. So what we've seen is that there seems to be a very strong desire for people to have more opportunities to discuss these issues and also to access supporting mechanisms in the future. And just to mention one very final point in our conclusions, it was extremely noticeable in our data collection, and this could be UK based, but it could be something of relevance in other countries as well, that people were talking an awful lot about co-creation. When I talk about co-creation with my students, I use the example of desire paths, as they are sometimes known. They have many other translations in different languages, but these are pathways that we as people, as humans, cut through. This is a picture of our campus at UWE. We've got the nicely designed bike and pedestrian pathway on the right of the picture, and on the left we've got where our students actually wish to walk. And that's the way that I often think about co-creation in science communication. because our university has tried to understand and appreciate that, and they have organised an exercise trail down by this pedestrian path that our students have created. But still, our students have said, no, this is not how we want to use this path. We would like to use this as an area to store our shopping trolleys at the end of the day. So despite best efforts in terms of thinking about what we might like to see happening when we're planning research activities, ultimately the public will sometimes influence and seek to decide. So the question in terms of coming back to ethics is, where on this pathway of co-creation do the stop checks fit? If we're involving people in science communication, engagement and co-creation activities throughout, at what point do we take a moment to pause and think about the ethical dimensions? We don't yet have any resources to help support this directly from the project, but there are other resources out there on this slide. So if you're interested in exploring any of the themes from this presentation further, there's some examples from the literature here. And there's also at the bottom of the slide 3 great web pages for organisations that are already working in this ethical space, slightly beyond science communication, but with excellent materials that can be used to think about science communication ethics further. And if you'd like to be kept up to date with further outputs from the project, we're undertaking writing at the moment and planning publications in future, and hoping to go for some further funding for additional events as well. And there's a quick form here that you can sign up to, and then you will be on a mailing list purely for the basis of this project to receive future updates. That's everything that I was planning to say today. Thank you so much for listening. Gracias. Really appreciate any input that you can have, and welcome any questions or comments via email afterwards.